Chapter 1, Top Secret. Just 2 days before they vanished to the world, Jim Whittaker and the 4 members of his regular air transport command crew had been looking forward to some time off. Air transport crews didn't fly combat missions, but they served an important purpose in a war that ranged far and wide across the globe. They flew planes, supplies, and people from training bases to the battlefront and back again. Whittaker, Cherry, DeAngelis, Bartek, and Reynolds had been doing this for 10 months since the U.S. entered the war. They had just picked up a B-24 Liberator bomber in the South Pacific and brought it to Hawaii. That afternoon, they were scheduled to fly a B-17 from Hawaii to San Francisco. Then they'd take off for a well-earned leave. John DeAngelis, the crew's navigator, couldn't wait to see his new bride, Mary. She was his high school sweetheart, and she had flown out from Pennsylvania to California for the wedding. They'd been forced to cut the celebration short when DeAngelis was called to duty to pick up the B-24. The radio man, Jim Reynolds, had gotten engaged in between his 6 trips across the Pacific, so he was eager to get home, too. Johnny Bartek, the engineer, was the youngest of them all, at 22. Less than a month ago, he'd opened a letter from his parents in Freehold, New Jersey. The news left him numb. Back home, his sister Ruth had hit her head on a wall while roller skating. Blood pooled inside her brain from the impact, and the next day she died on the way to school. It was hard to get your mind around. Out in the world, men were surviving onslaughts of bullets and bombs, and his sister had died walking to school. Ruth had been born on his birthday, August 30th. She was 17 years old. Bartek just wanted to get home to see his family. At 5 p.m., the crew strode across Hickam Airfield toward the plane. The bright blue waters of Pearl Harbor glistened a few hundred yards to the west. It was so peaceful in the Hawaiian sun that Jim Whittaker had trouble imagining the violence that had torn this place apart 10 months ago when the Japanese had launched a surprise attack. But this was where the war had started for all of them, and all the signs were still there. Bullet holes pockmarked the airplane hangars. A giant crane towered over the harbor, preparing to haul the crippled battleship Oklahoma upright again. At night, Army police patrolled the streets to make sure all lights were out, in case the bombers came back. It was just after dawn on December 7th, 1941, when 353 Japanese planes came screaming out of the sky over the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. People who lived near the base thought it was just another combat exercise. Their morning coffee had been interrupted before by the sound of machine gun fire. This time, a dark cloud began to rise over the harbor, and many people thought it was a smokescreen laid down for the latest in a series of training games. But the Navy men aboard the warships in the harbor knew only too well that this was no game. The bombs fell on battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Fuel tanks exploded into flames. A 16-inch shell tore into the battleship Arizona's forward magazine, and a searing column of fire erupted thousands of feet into the air. Fragments of steel and wood rained down on the wreckage. Human body parts fell from the sky. Men who had been burned snow-white stumbled on the decks until they fell over. Before long, 18 ships lay crippled at the surface or sank to the bottom of the harbor. At the airfields, planes swept in so low that some people remembered making eye contact with the enemy pilots. 43 fighter planes, lightning-quick Japanese Zeros, hit Hickam Field right where Whittaker walked 10 months later. They sprayed machine gun fire like sheets of rain. Airmen were gunned down while they raced to their planes. At Hickam alone, 189 people were killed. Of the 400 aircraft on the island, just 60 escaped damage. Exactly 8 made it into the air to fight back. Unless you counted the American Revolution, the United States had been attacked by a foreign power only once in 166 years, in 1812. Now it had happened again, a date which will live in infamy, President Franklin Roosevelt proclaimed. Then he declared war on Japan. Germany rushed to the defense of its Japanese ally and declared war on the United States. The American people suddenly found themselves swept into World War II, the most destructive war in history. Whittaker, who had been flying single-engine planes since his 20s, put his construction business on hold and joined the Army. At 40, he was too old to fly in combat, but he figured if he flew transport planes, it would free up a younger pilot to fight. When the crew arrived at their B-17 that October afternoon and found new orders waiting for them, Whittaker took it in stride. They were headed back into the Pacific. There would be no trip home to see his wife and his 16-year-old daughter, no side trip to visit the Navy base in San Francisco where his son was training, but this was what Jim Whittaker had signed up for. Besides, the orders that were handed to Captain Cherry announced the name of their famous passenger, Eddie Rickenbacker. The crew talked about it on the way back to the base as they waited for their new takeoff time. If you had to lose a few days off, this wasn't a bad reason. They'd all get to meet the great flying ace, and with Rickenbacker aboard, chances were they'd get as close to the action as possible. The crew were back at the plane well before the 10:30 p.m. takeoff time, checking instruments, stowing food, topping off the fuel tanks. They were joined by Alex Kay, a second engineer who was there to help Bartek keep the plane running smoothly. The B-17 wasn't exactly a luxury ride. It was a giant, clumsy fighting machine known as the Flying Fortress. When it went to war, it lived up to its name, carrying at least 5 machine guns and more than 2 tons of bombs. For transport missions, the gear was stripped out, but some things remained the same. The planes were still unheated, open to the air, and deafeningly loud. Exactly 2 minutes before takeoff, Whittaker felt the plane rock under the weight of 2 new passengers. In a moment, the VIP came up behind him and introduced himself, only one name needed. "My name is Rickenbacker." He introduced his military aide, Colonel Hans Adamson. But it was clear he was in no mood for small talk. Rickenbacker and Adamson took the 2 seats just behind Whittaker and Cherry and belted in for takeoff. Bartek, the engineer from New Jersey, came forward to find that Adamson had taken his seat. But Private Bartek had been in the military long enough to know how things worked. Officers got the best of everything, and privates were left to pick up the crumbs. Like a lot of enlisted men, he'd grumble about it when there was no one around who outranked him, but he wouldn't dream of arguing with a colonel. Bartek found another seat and strapped in. With all 8 men aboard, Cherry pulled onto the runway and picked up speed. They were halfway to liftoff and well above 60 miles an hour when one of the brakes suddenly seized. The plane lurched left and careened toward the hangars. Rickenbacker started to get up. He opened his mouth to say something, looking for a minute like he wanted to take over. Then he thought better of it and sat back down. By this time, Cherry was already wrestling the plane into a ground loop, a tight, barely controlled circle at high speed. The idea was to drain the plane's momentum gradually without hurtling off the airfield into a building. But for the better part of a minute, they spun around like a high-speed amusement park ride. Just below the cockpit, in the navigator's bay, John DeAngelis hung on for dear life. If one of the wheels gave out, the nose of the plane would collapse in a heap on the runway. DeAngelis would be the first thing to hit the ground. Thanks to Captain Cherry's skills, the navigator was spared. The high-speed ride came to a smooth stop, and Rickenbacker complimented Cherry on the maneuver. A tow truck hauled the bomber back to the hangar, and the men began unloading their equipment into another B-17. The crew were surprised to find they were taking off again as soon as they could transfer the gear. Normally, they'd take a new plane up for a trial run. As engineer, Bartek would spend a couple of hours inspecting it to make sure everything was flight-worthy. DeAngelis would get to check his navigation instruments. Captain Cherry objected to the quick turnaround time, which Bartek was happy to see. That was just like their pilot, always looking out for his crew. But the general in charge said that if the captain was afraid to take on the mission, they would just get another pilot. Cherry was too proud to back down from a challenge, so they all got ready to fly. Whatever this mission was, Bartek figured, it must be important to somebody. As the cots and mailbags and provisions exited the original plane, Whittaker noticed DeAngelis inspecting a piece of equipment. It was an octant, an instrument used to measure latitude and longitude from thousands of feet in the air. The octant had taken a beating during the ground loop, DeAngelis said. "Anything wrong with it?" Whittaker asked. "Doesn't seem to be," the navigator replied. DeAngelis cradled the octant in his hand and carried it aboard their new plane. By 1:30 a.m., when the nose of the B-17 rose successfully into the sky, he had settled the instrument in place on his new table. There, as the sun rose over the Pacific, he would use it to chart a course for their first refueling stop, Canton Island.